So here we are, 7 years to the day.
You're kidding.
Yeah, when I brought it in 2014. A lot's changed in that time.
So I have 5 EBTCMs.
Yeah.
They're all garbage.
All garbage. So I will release a video talking about this experience. So if you're in this situation in the future, you'll know what to do. Trust me, it's the ABS controller.
I don't know. Do you ever know what to do on these things?
That is true. They're not easy.
Like how did we know that we were getting defects when the things were such low miles?
Yeah. It's weird, huh?
No, it pisses me off.
Yeah. It's weird too how like...
Bottom line is you can't be buying them from a junkyard.
Yeah, because they're fucked up.
Because if they get in a wreck,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I mean, they must short internally or something.
It's possible.
You know, these vets, I gotta make these things go away. Fuck. So this one, that one right there,
Yeah.
I've got one of my plates on it just so I could drive it and blow out the oil.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know?
Man, that's a resto mod right there, huh?
Yeah, it's a 58 with a 2018 LT1 in it.
Oh, Jesus. That's awesome.
Yeah, but you know, it's got a lot of C4 stuff.
Yeah, well, the suspension and chassis.
Just at the San Mateo show, and a couple other guys that were up there told me, "Oh yeah, we saw that 58 you work on up there." You have a lot of this shit under your car.
Yeah, I could tell. I have those
Yeah, the Vette brakes.
those rods there. What are those called?
Look at how long the half shafts are.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's too bad it's got such skinny tires.
Yeah, you just need some meats on this thing.
Yeah, you know.
So I forgot just how beautiful this car is. 7 years. Now, I'm going to explain in another video why it was gone 7 years. But I am really happy to have this guy back. And I really love those 5-spoke wheels. I know it's old school, but I guess I'm an old school fool. Still got my North Star Corvette stickers on it. Okay, so why was my car gone 7 years? It was really crazy, but before I can get into the exact details as to why my car was gone that long, you have to understand something. I hadn't had my car 2 years prior to that because my mechanic was building this amazing stroker motor. So what had happened was I'd spun a rod bearing a few years before that. That was 2012. And, you know, as you know, it takes time to build an engine. I wasn't building it myself. Dave Bonar from North Star Auto Tech was the guy that built it. And he's an amazing engine builder. There's not a man on this earth that knows C4 Corvettes better than him. Better than anyone. I mean, seriously, this guy knows them in and out. And, you know, he works on all kinds of Corvettes. He works on early C1s. And he knows a lot about the C7s as well, C5s, C6s. He's the guy. So he'd built my 355, which was a very powerful engine, and I realize I'm kind of jumping back in time here, but when I do the full review of my 96, I'll be really specific about, everything that happened to that car and why I did what I did to that car. But prior to that, I'd had a really badass 355 that he built. And what happened was, well, this happens a lot when you race. Things get damaged. And I think what happened in that case, I had one of these knock sensors that got busted up. And what knock sensors basically do is they sense detonation and they let your computer know that, hey, you better detune the engine because it's either too hot or something's going on, there's not enough fuel. And what ended up happening was it spun a rod bearing. And of course, I had raced this car with this 355 engine for quite some time. And the reason why I built a 355, well, for one thing, I wanted it to pass smog in California, which is never easy. And Dave made it happen. It's pretty amazing. It had long tube headers on it. It had a cam. It had some wicket heads on it, airflow research heads. And he was just able to, he built it and he pushed it absolutely to the limit. And it barely passed smog, but it did pass. Now, you got to remember, that's when the, I would say the visual parts of the smog inspections were a bit more loose back at that time. Now, that's pretty much all what they look at when you get your car smogged in California, especially if it's a newer car. They just plug it in, they check to see if there's any of the ODB2 lights that pop up. They make sure all your emissions are working properly, and every part has to have an EO number, and they run it, and they don't even plug the pipe on the later model cars. On the older cars like my 96, they definitely would plug the pipe. So anyway, once things got more stringent, I remember having this discussion with Dave. I said, you know what, screw it. If I can't have it on the street anymore and make it a total badass pavement melter, then what I'm going to go ahead and do, I'm just going to build a really badass stroker motor. So what we ended up doing, I wanted to build, I left a lot of this to Dave's discretion because he obviously knows a lot more about engine building than I do. But he decided, I said, so what should we build? 396? And he never liked 383s because the dwell time isn't very high on it. And he thought we both agreed that a 396 would probably be the thing to build. So he ran all the numbers, did all the specs, and he said, it's actually going to be a 397 with 30 over pistons and a larger crank. And I forget what size the crank was. So I'm like, cool. So I didn't hold back at all. I mean, I went for the most badass parts available. So I got this Cali's crank. Now, if you've ever looked at Cali's website, you should do it sometime. So they have different levels of cranks. So for those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with really high-end parts for engines, basically the two best cranks you could get is a Cali's crank or a Crowler crank. But it's mostly Cali's crank that professional race cars use. And my thinking with that was I wanted to have top flight parts that are made in the U.S. And even in the future, if I ever needed to do a rebuild, it's just a freshen up is all it is. You send the rotating assembly, the rods, the crank, out the pistons out to the machine shop. They do a little bit of machine work on them. They balance them. They put new bearings and new piston rings on, and you just put the engine back together. I mean, that's what professional racers do. Although they do it every race. I hope to do it like once every 10 years. So anyway, I decided to go for the most badass crank available. Not only was it a stroker crank, a much larger crank, it was made of something called Timken steel. Now, for those of you that haven't looked at the website, you should check it out. The entry-level crank is something called the Dragon Slayer crank. And then there's another crank above the Dragon Slayer. And don't get me wrong, any of the cranks that you get from Cali's are top-notch, no question about it. So I got the highest level crank you can get. It's made of Timken steel. So not only is it 4340 forged steel like they all are, Cali's crank, it's got the hardest steel known to man called Timken steel. And it was much lighter than all the other cranks and infinitely lighter than my factory crank. So what does that mean? When you have a lighter rotating assembly, meaning rods, pistons, crank, the car will accelerate that much faster. So like for every pound you save in unsprung weight, in rotating weight, rotating mass, it's like 4 pounds everywhere else. So you feel it when you drive. I mean, the engine just absolutely just, I can't describe, it's like lightning fast acceleration. I mean, the RPMs just go from like 1,000 to 6,000 almost instantly. It's really amazing, but you got to watch your tach closely because it's very easy to over rev it. Yes, there's rev limiters, but you don't want to bang the rev limiter, because when you bang the rev limiter on those years of car, what happens is it cuts fuel to the engine. It decelerates. That's how it does it. It cuts fuel and it retards spark. All things that could cause detonation. So you don't want to go anywhere near the rev limiter if you want your engine to live a long time. And that was my other thinking going with the stroker motor, because now I could not have to rev it as high to make the power, because the torque is going to be absolutely ballistic. So that's what we did. It was going to be a 397, which, if you know about cars and you're into Dodges and Mopar, then you know a 392 is basically the Scat Pack engine, is what they call it. Their highest horsepower engine that you could get without the supercharger. So it's something in between, you know, the entry level Hemi in the Challenger Charger and the Hellcat, which is the blown engine that makes crazy 800 horsepower, whatever it is. So, and I think that Dodge engine makes like 485. It's more like 500, but that's pretty much what we were shooting for, like around 500 to 550 horsepower. So anyway, I got that crank. I already had the airflow research heads. We just had to rebuild the valve train because we're going to put a more aggressive cam in it, because we don't have to worry about smog. We got Wisco forged aluminum pistons. I had Cali's rods. That's what I bought with it. So basically, the whole rotating assembly had to be larger pistons. So we went from 30 over pistons to 40 over pistons. And so if you've ever ordered a rotating assembly for an engine, what you basically do is you buy a whole entire assembly. You don't just buy the crank. You don't just buy the rods and the pistons. That gets really expensive. So what you try to do is, and they sell them in packages. So I got the crank I wanted. I got the Cali's rods. That was an affordable option, and Cali's makes excellent rods as well. And then I decided to go with Wisco pistons. But what I found was, or my mechanic found was, I couldn't get 30 over pistons for it. I had to get 40 over pistons. And that bumped the displacement up to 397. So it was a 397 cubic inch engine. And that's the interesting thing. So when I run into people that have Dodges and they ask me about my engine, or I ask them about theirs, I always tell them, yeah, you know, that's a lot like my 96 Corvette, because I was trying to build a 392, and they always kind of look at me funny like, what, 392 on a Chevy? I'm like, yeah, well, it wasn't factory. I was trying to build a stroker motor at 392, and it ended up being a 397 because I had to put the bigger pistons in, which is 40 over pistons. Okay, so now you know the history. Now you know how excited I was, because as soon as I got this engine tuned, as soon as I put the break-in miles in on the engine, that was a whole nother story. I could probably do a video on that alone. I had to break it in on the street. Yes, it's not smog legal, so I was sweating bullets driving it on the street, but I was not going to do what my mechanic suggested, Dave suggested. He's like, oh, just do an autocross and go, you know, half throttle. Now, I know myself well enough to know that if I went on a road course or an autocross, there's no way I would go half speed or half throttle. It's like playing football half speed. Nobody plays football half speed. If you do, you shouldn't be on the field. So anyway, broke the engine in. I was super excited. And my first race back was in Crow's Landing, which I've been racing lately, in California. It's this old NASA base that they used to do a lot of research on, and it's a huge airfield, high-speed autocross. I can't tell you, it had been 2 years, actually almost 2 years, maybe about a year and a half before my last race that I had, you know, because the engine was being built, and I can't tell you how excited I was. I mean, and I was nervous that I was going to be kind of rusty. You know, I missed a whole season and a half, almost 2 full seasons. Actually, I did miss 2 full seasons. Yeah, that would have been my 3rd season I would have missed. So, okay, 2014. So I get out there, and by the 2nd or 3rd lap, I mean, like, everything came back to me. And I can't tell you how ballistically fast it was. I mean, it even caught me by surprise. I had to, like, it took me 2 laps to get used to the crazy speed that car had on the straightaways, because I wasn't sure where my braking points were going to be. You know, every time you get in a car and you've changed your setup, it changes everything, especially when you make a more powerful engine. Where you think you're supposed to brake isn't where you're supposed to brake. That's what you'll find out. And of course, the brakes are modified. And I'll talk about all that, the chassis stuff, in the review. But I wanted to give you some background about how excited I was, right? Because after that race, just to give you some context, in my class, the 2nd place person was 4 seconds behind me. Yes, 4 seconds. That's how fast my car was. I mean, in terms of racing in class, there was nothing that would touch my car and me as a driver in that class. It was amazing. So, what happens? 2 weeks later, I have a race in another place where my Corvette club always races, or used to race. It's in Marina, California. If you're not familiar with where that is, it's basically very close to Monterey and Carmel. It's just a little bit further north. If you've ever been to Monterey or Carmel, you've driven through it. It's an old air base. It's the Fort Ord Air Base. Has a huge airfield, and we race out there as well. We did most of my racing I've done was out there. Now, unfortunately, and I've always wondered this most of my life, when it was that some developer was going to come in there and start building houses because of its close proximity to Monterey and Carmel, I just thought the potential for land values was really high there. And it was. It just took time for a developer to actually go in there. So we don't race there anymore, but back then we did. And I remember I got out there, and that was my 2nd autocross. I got out there of that season, which 2 weeks before was Crow's Landing, which is in the valley. It's south of Tracy in a town called Patterson. So Patterson's just, you know, if you've ever driven through Patterson, you live in Northern California, you take the 5 to go to LA. It's on the way to LA. And the great part about it is it's only about 30 minutes from my house in Tracy, so it's pretty close. I love racing there. But this time we were out at Marina. So, and I remember thinking I came off such a high from that race at Crow's Landing because nobody in my class was touching me anywhere close to me. I get out there, and my first 2 runs were kind of shaky. I was kind of putting everything together on my 3rd lap. And basically you get 5 laps. Sometimes you only get 4 laps depending on how many cars are entered. But if you get 5 laps, generally you get 5 laps. And you got to figure things out usually by the 3rd lap, because laps 4 and 5, you want to go balls out. I mean, no joke. So anyway, I get out there and on the 3rd lap, and I notice that when I came out of the straightaway, I had to go through this sweeper right before the finish line, and the front brakes locked up. And I just couldn't figure out why that was. You know, why did my front brakes lock up? That's weird. So that was my 3rd lap. So the 4th lap, I get out there, and I'm like, okay, I guess I'm coming in a little too hot. So I thought I'd enter slower. I entered slower, and guess what happened? The brakes locked up again. Well, long story short, after that race, I realized something's wrong with my brakes. So that began me and my mechanic falling down this rabbit hole. Now, what happened? So I bring the car to him, and, you know, naturally he thinks it's an ABS sensor or something really simple. Now, one of the things he did around that time, he gave me a code reader. It's a really cheap thing. You just plug into your ODB2 port, and it runs the diagnostics. Now, he liked me doing that because I give him some idea of what could be wrong with the car. And I take a snapshot of it. And you got to remember, this is when iPhones were getting really powerful. I think I had a 4S at the time. No, actually, by then I had a 6. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I could take good pictures of it. And I ran a diagnostics and took a picture of it and sent it to him. And it indicated, you know, an ABS sensor. So brought the car to him. He ran all the diagnostics, and he says, you know, I think it's just probably some ABS sensors your front left ABS sensor, its reading is bad, so I'll just replace it. So I'm like, okay, I leave the car with him. I get a call the next day, and he says, well, I've replaced the ABS sensor, and I took it out for a test drive, and guess what? It locked up again. I'm like, oh, that sucks. He's like, yeah, it's kind of annoying. So I'm going to run some more tests, and if I can't figure out what the problem is, I'm 90% sure it's an ABS controller. Because when things don't start making sense with brake issues on these cars, it's almost always an ABS sensor. But he had told me at that time he had never had to replace an ABS controller, because that's a pretty big job. It's basically the brains of the whole entire brake system on 96 Corvettes. Basically 92 through 96 Corvettes all had the same ABS controller. And, you know, it shouldn't be surprising because the 84s through 91s basically had similar braking systems and master cylinders and all of that. But I think it was 86 they introduced ABS, and that was the most basic ABS system that had been available at that time because it was so new, the technology was. But by 1992, when they came with LT1s as standard engines, they had upgraded the ABS systems. By 93, they had something called traction control, which they called anti-slip regulation, ASR. So it had become more complex. And from what he had told me was he had never replaced the ABS controller on his 96 and had never done it to any 92 through 96 that he could remember. So I thought, okay, all right, well, can you get one? And he's like, yeah, I can get them, but GM doesn't make them anymore. And you got to remember, this is 2014. The car's a 96. Certain parts GM just doesn't license to other third-party companies, like ABS controllers. You have to buy one from another car, usually a crash car, or maybe one with a blown engine that the guy didn't want to rebuild, so it gets parted out. So basically, Dave bought an ABS controller, put it on mine, gave me a call and said, okay, it's in there. I'm going to test drive it. It should be good. So he takes it out there, and guess what happens? The car locks up. I kid you not. So at this point, he starts to have some doubts about whether or not it is an ABS controller. I'm convinced it is. So he ends up buying another one, right? Puts it in my car, checks everything out, and guess what? It locks up again. So now Dave's 100% convinced, or 98% convinced, it's not an ABS controller. So I have no idea what it is because I have a real minute understanding of how all of this works. So this is where things get kind of crazy. And Dave ends up replacing everything. I mean, he checks all the lines. He replaces all the ABS sensors on every corner. Eventually, he ends up replacing the calipers and the rotors, even though they didn't need to be replaced. He put different brake boosters in it, changed the master cylinder, and nothing worked. And it finally got to a point where, like, I think my car was just in Dave's head. Because he was just completely demoralized by this. And I was too, to be honest. I saw what it was doing to him. And this is a guy that could pretty much fix any issue on a C4 Corvette, or any Corvette, really. And, you know, we were getting nowhere with it. So fast forward through time, Dave kind of had to just get away from it for a while. And a couple years went by, you know, and I know this sounds crazy, but yeah, it was a couple years. It was around 2016. And he calls me up and he tells me, hey, you know, I was looking at the whole diagram of the ABS on this. This is such a simple ABS setup. I don't really understand why I can't fix this. But he's saying, I'm going to check for some other things that could, you know, maybe are on the periphery of ABS. Maybe it's not a brake issue specifically, but it could affect how the brakes work. So I'm like, okay. And he ends up finding that the car needs a lateral accelerometer. That basically, I think, the computer senses pitch and dive and roll and things like that. So anyway, he replaces it, takes it out for a test drive, and guess what happened? Didn't work. So at this point, Dave's just like, he's mentally done. And I don't blame him on this. I'm mentally done too. This is where I started thinking, okay, what am I going to do? I have this insane engine, this great chassis. This car is worth so much more than what its Kelley Blue Book value is. I'm really in a bad spot here. So then I'm thinking, should I take the engine out? My buddy Dave's like, hey, I've got a C4 with a cage in it. I'll give you the car, and I can put your stroker motor in it. And I'm just like, oh my God, I don't want to do that because I love my 96 Corvette. I've had it since February of 98. It's super clean everywhere. This car he's talking about is a pure race car. It's gutted. It really looks like something out of Mad Max. So I'm like, okay, we got to fix this. So, oh gosh, it was just so frustrating at that point. And so every now and then he would tweak with it and try different things, and it wouldn't work. So finally one day around 2019, this is right before the pandemic started, he's like, I got an idea. Why don't we just disconnect the ABS? So he basically told me you could race without ABS, right? And I thought about it, and I'm like, I probably could, although I've never raced without it. But there are times with 92 through 96 Corvettes when you race and there's maybe like it's off camber, there's a change in surface and you're on the brakes hard before a turn, and sometimes you'll get that hard pedal. Basically the ABS or the power brakes will quit working. It won't lock up, but it'll be like a hard pedal, and you really got to slam it and then take your foot off a little bit and slam it again, right? So I figured it'd be kind of like that. And Dave's saying, look, professional race cars don't have ABS. You just have to know how to brake and sense when you're locking it up. So I'm like, okay, let's do that. Because I just wanted my car back at this point. So he basically disconnects the ABS. He puts together his own kind of proportioning valve in there. Because what you have to understand is the ABS controller on 92 through 96 Corvettes are basically the proportioning valves, which decides how much pressure, how much brake pressure to each corner, each brake, right? Left, right, front, back. And there's, regulates the amount of brake fluid. So he does that, spends a lot of time, gets the car out there, test drives it, and guess what happens? It locks up again. So at this point, I'm just like, okay, I got to figure out what to do here because it doesn't appear that we're ever going to be able to get it fixed. So I basically have a timetable in my head. And about another 2 years or so, I'm like, I have to make a decision by then, and I have to figure out what I'm going to do. So, I'm going back and forth thinking, well, maybe one day, and I hate to think like this, I could put that engine in my father's 96 Corvette because he doesn't drive anymore. He's 93 years old. But I'm thinking, his car is so nice, so unmolested. It's such a great street car. I mean, and it's an automatic, and that's going to make it more difficult. So going back and forth, and one day I'm watching that show Wheeler Dealers with these two Brits on there, these two British guys, Mike, and then I forget what the other guy's name is. It wasn't Ed, the previous, co-star. He had stepped down by then. It was a new British guy that was on there that was his mechanic. So anyway, this particular episode, they have a 2001 Z06 Corvette on there. Now, I just laughed about it. I think it was actually a 2002. Anyway, it doesn't matter. 2002 through 2004 Z06. So I have a 2001 Z06. And it really caught my attention. And I'm watching it, and these guys get this car, and they realize the ABS doesn't work on it. The brakes are really bad. So in my head, I just have this cringe moment of, oh man, these guys have no idea what they're getting involved in, right? And basically, Mike takes the ABS controller and brings it to this place in Southern California. Now, they didn't mention the name of the shop. They just had the guy on there, and they're in his shop, and he basically disassembles the ABS controller. And when he tells Mike, look, most of the time when these things aren't functional, it's because one or two or more solenoids are bad on it. Once you replace the solenoids on them, they're good to go. They're like new. So I watched this and I ended up taping this whole segment on my iPhone and I sent it to my mechanic. And he basically told me, well, it's a no can do on your car because it has to be 2001 or newer. He says if it was your Z06, we could repair it, but you can't repair ABS controllers that are pre 2001. That includes C5s from 97 through 2000. And of course, mine's a 96. So I'm just like, oh my God, I thought I was onto something. So then one day, we're fast forwarding here. It's during the height of the pandemic. And I have dinner with him in this place we love to eat in Los Altos. And of course, we're eating outside because it's the dog days of the pandemic and we don't have our vaccines yet. And I was telling him about how I have an idea about what to do with my car. And he looks at me and he just rolls his eyes and says, what are we going to do about your car? Oh my God, right? And I could just see the frustration, right? And I can feel it, believe me. So I tell him, look, I got the best way to figure out what the problem is. And he looks at me like, what do you mean you have the best solution here? I'm like, try this. I said, take the ABS controller out of your 96, put it in mine. If it works, then we know it's in fact an ABS controller. If it doesn't work, then we can rule out an ABS controller. And he looks at me and he says, that's a lot of work. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's a lot of work, but it's worth it. Then you'll know, you'll have some peace of mind. Yeah, so he kind of blows me off a little bit, but that's how Dave is. Just because he kind of poo-poos on an idea at first doesn't mean he won't do it later. And of course, one day he calls me up about, I don't know, a month and maybe 3 months later. And he says, hey, I put my ABS controller in your car. And I was just stunned. I'm all, you did? He's like, yeah. So if you want, come by the shop and test drive it because I'm not test driving it. And I could just feel the anger in his voice, right? And I get it, believe me. So I go there, right? And I show up and it's one of those situations where I had a client cancel on me and I had an hour. Well, I had about an hour and a half. And I ended up driving. His place is in Mountain View, his shop on Calderon. It's about 30 miles, 30 minutes south of where I work. So I get in the car, I go there. And as soon as I pull into his shop, I pulled into the courtyard area that leads into his garage bays where all his technicians are working. And it was funny because one of his technicians, in fact, all of his technicians, they saw me get out of the car and they all stopped what they were doing. And they're like, okay, Scott, go ahead and drive it. Just try it, okay? And it was interesting because they wouldn't tell me if it worked. They wouldn't tell me if they had test driven it. So one of his mechanics, Abed, was looking at me like, come on. And he had this glimmer in his eyes. And when I saw that glimmer, I thought, oh my God, there's some hope that this actually works. So I get in the car, get it started up, and oh man, the sound of that stroker motor, I mean, it is like just music to my ears. So I get in there, pull it out onto the street, and usually the way it works on Villa Street, that's the cross street to his shop, you pull out onto, and there's just maybe the short half block, and you come to a stop sign. Now, that's not enough runoff room to test the ABS. So I make a left turn onto Calderon, and I usually get it up to about 60 miles an hour, and then I slam the brakes on. Of course, I make sure nobody's anywhere near in front of me, because if you do, you could slide right into them. And I slam the brakes on, and guess what happened? It stopped. I was stunned. The ABS light came on. So then I just couldn't believe what had happened. So I made a right turn and I went down this long street that's about, 40, 50 mile an hour speed limit. And I looked around, I don't see any cops. And I got up to about 65, 70 and I slammed the brakes on and the car came to a dig. It stopped. But I noticed the tires slid a little bit and the ABS light came on. So I just kept driving it and doing it and driving it and braking. And I was just like, Scott, this is working. Because before you would go, 15 miles an hour and hit the brakes quickly and it would slide. It would lock up and slide the front tires. So I just drove the shit out of it for like 20 minutes. A half an hour. I lost track of time. I was so excited. I pull back in his shop. I look at my boy Dave. He happens to show up. He's got this pissed off look on his face. And I'm like, and he's all, well, what? What's the verdict? And I looked at him and I said, it stopped. And I expected him to be really excited about it, but he just looked pissed. And then I started to think about it, how much time and money he had to spend on fixing my car, right? So I get it, totally get it. He's pissed off, and I hear him swearing in his shop. He's complaining that he's got 4 ABS controllers that are boat anchors, and his actually worked. So I realized I took it out again one more time, and I realized the tires in that time, these are my street tires. They were Nitto NTO5s, really good street tires. They're, I think, 200 tread wear, which means they're pretty soft. And I got out there and I noticed it was spinning. It could spin the tires first gear, second gear, third gear, even fourth gear. And I forgot how fast that car was. It was just blowing my mind away. And then I realized these tires are really old. So I kept that in mind. So I brought the car back in, and Dave's kind of in a bad mood, but you know, underneath all his anger, I could see he's excited. So I tell him it works, and he's like, okay, that's great. Now I got 4 ABS controllers that don't work, and now I have to get another. I'm like, yeah, I know, and you got to put it back in your 96. He's like, yeah, exactly. So what he ended up doing was he bought another ABS controller. This one he got a guarantee on from the previous owner that it worked. And he put it in my car, and he put his ABS controller back in his car. And of course, when he took it out, it locked up again. And he just couldn't understand why it didn't work. So he sent it back to the previous guy, got his money back. He went and got another ABS controller. And of course, no guarantee with that one. And he put it in my car, took it out. I remember him calling me up that day saying, you know, this has got to work. So I'm like, okay. So he took it out, he drove it, and it locked up again. So he was just beyond livid. So they took the ABS controller out, and it had a few codes in it. So one of his technicians, his name is Vette, is a younger guy, and he's really tech savvy. And he plugged it into his computer, and I guess I don't know what they were using, to all data or something like that. And he found there was a few updates, software updates from a long time ago that needed to go out to that ABS controller. And he did a few other things to it, software stuff that I don't really remember. They put it back in the car. Abed took it out this time and drove it, and it worked. And then I came back again, and he told me to test drive it and said, make sure it works because I want this thing out of here. So I took it out, I drove it, and oh my God, it worked. It worked so fabulously well. So that is why the car was gone 7 years. And by the time I actually picked it up, which he had to do a few more things before he could, you know, give the car back to me. It was in his shop for so long. It needed plugs. It needed an oil change. It needed a few minor things. He even replaced the center console on it. So it's absolutely perfect right now, and I can't be any happier. And I'm so glad my mechanic Dave didn't give up on the car. I didn't give up on the car, and it's like seventh heaven right now because I took the car out to Crow's Landing back in November, and oh my God, it was a blast. If you haven't seen that video, go to my channel, you'll see it. It's the last video I released, racing my 96. And I'm going to do a review on this car and just go over everything I've done to it. I'll talk about what it was like stock, you know, what the specs were and what I've done to it over the years and why I did what I did to it. And I'll answer whatever questions you have in the comment section. And I really wanted, you know, whoever it is that's watching this video right now to understand that if you have a C4 Corvette from these years, and you're experiencing lockups like this and ABS issues, hit me up on there, leave a comment, and maybe I can guide you because it probably is the ABS controller if it's not stopping. If you're in a situation where you've replaced the ABS sensors, you've done the obvious things like the brakes, the calipers, you know there's plenty of brake pressure and it's still not stopping, chances are it's the ABS controller. It really is. So anyway, please like the video if you watched it this long. Subscribe to my channel. I'm going to have a lot more content relating to racing in the future. And it'll be a different video than this one. Trust me, this was more of an analysis video and up for people that may be going through similar situations that I went through. So anyway, glad to get the car back. I'm excited, and I'll have more content for you in the future. All right? All right. Peace out.